So welcome to this amazing journey that I want to take you all on, which is Jewish history through the lens, if you want, and pandemic, epidemic, from wherever we can actually cull sources and tell a story. You're about to come on a fascinating journey, and here we are in the year 2020. That's what they tell me. And if you notice, I have some facial covering called a mask. And it's become law in certain situations where you have to have yourself covered. Now, what's really interesting is if you study our sources, you'll begin to see, and by our sources I mean Chazal, Chachamim, Halacha, Rishonim, Achronim, you begin to see that a covering over a face was not unusual, especially after certain illnesses, which I'll describe as we go along through this crazy journey. What I want to show you in the short time that we have is the resilience of the Jewish people in spite of not just epidemics or pandemics, but part of it involves wars, famine, poverty, and a whole bunch of other situations. But somehow, within this sad story that spans so many generations in different situations, there is a thread of inspiration. And somehow I hope to show you that too. So what am I referring to? So everybody knows, and I don't think we need a close-up, but this is the famous Mishnah Brura. Okay, now if one opens up the Mishnah Brura carefully, in the laws of Tisha B'Av, in Siman Kuf Nun Dalid, actually on Oz Vav, in Siv Vav of Tav Kuf Nun Dalid, these are the halachas of Tisha B'Av, and it speaks, one line there, the b'makom choli, where there is an illness, lo gozer rabbanon. But exactly what that has to do with Tisha B'Av and fasting, you can look it up. In the Bir Halacha there, the Chafetz Chaim quotes a book called Pischei Olam, and he speaks, this Pischei Olam, of the illness of cholera, which was quite prevalent, and we'll discuss cholera on this journey. But within that, suddenly he says that at what point you can go out, no longer quarantined from cholera, lahachricho k'sheyetze, you should force the person who's going outside in public, yisa saviv lechot mo upiv, to carry around their face a chatika kamfa, to put on their face basically a mask, and then some type of a, what should I call it, vegetation that smelled good or maybe healed an illness. Now, when we'll speak of cholera, the idea of quarantining, and it comes much earlier, I'll explain that in a minute, you already have this idea of walking around with a mask. And halacha picks it up too, so it's not that it's something unusual. So that's the Chafetz Chaim, not that long ago. Don't forget, Chafetz Chaim passed away in 1933, and cholera was quite serious in those days. But what I want to do is go back in time a little bit, and first of all discuss the term mageifa, which has been used so much. Now, interestingly enough, the word mageifa in Tanach appears 26 times. And in Tanach, it could mean anything from what we translate in English as a plague, people striking each other. It comes from the verb negef, to hit, to strike. So mageifa could be anything at all. In fact, Hashem says in Shmos, in Parak Tes, Pasuk Yudalid, when he speaks of the makos, and now that I've showed you my gimmick with the mask, I can remove it, and I've gotten your attention. When Hashem speaks of the makos, he basically says, Ani sholeach, I will send these plagues that he's sending into Egypt as magafosai, my mageifos. So mageifa is a general term that applies to any situation where suddenly there is death, there is hurt, there is pain, and people are dying. It could be hunger. A mageifa comes in many different ways. Now, when we look in Chazal, the Gemara mentions many different cases, and the most famous one appropriate to us is the Gemara in Bava Kama, the Samach Amud Beis, 2 or 3 lines from the top of the page, where the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanon, the Chachamim taught in a Brisa, if there's dever b'ir, and dever is another term of a mageifa or a plague, or an epidemic if you want, then what should you do? Kanes raglecha al toch beitecha. Stay inside. And this gets picked up in halacha too. So it was quite early that people became in what we call isolated, diminished, and we'll get back to many other cases, but the idea was there. And notice Chazal are giving us a piece of advice. If there's dever ba'ir, if people are dying, if there's an epidemic, get inside, don't go out. In fact, the Gemara continues there about Rava, who wouldn't even open up his windows in situations like this. And on the previous page, the Gemara discusses that famous idea that Rashi himself quotes in Chumash, which is Kivon shenosam rishus l'malach hamavet lahashchis. The minute the angel of death was given permission to go out and destroy, einu mafchim ben tzadik l'rasha. The malach hamavet no longer makes the distinction between the tzaddik and the rasha, and whoever's in its way, whatever that Gemara actually means, that's very much what happened in all these epidemics. Wrong person in the wrong time. Well, you know what? You were warned. You were told to stay inside. There's a danger out there. In fact, the Gemara in Tainus, around Daf Chaf Aleph, speaks of a city of basically a city of 1,500 people. If more than 9 people die over the period of 3 days, the Gemara says that's already a mageifa. So mageifa is mentioned in Chazal. It's mentioned in Midrashim. For example, the Medrash Tanchuma in Parshas Tetzaveh speaks of the idea that as a safeguard, and we'll speak a little bit of the safeguards or the shmira that comes along sometimes from these particular epidemics, is the ketores. And therefore it's become so common. One of the advantages that people have gotten out of saying the Parsha of ketores is particularly because in a mageifa, it stops a mageifa. And therefore advice given in the 1500s and in the 1600s when epidemics were rampant was stay inside and recite the Parsha of the ketores, because the ketores would actually be some type of a protection. But let me just do what we call house cleaning at the beginning. What's the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? Epidemic, at least in our modern terminology, the terms are usually used and switching back and forth. But an epidemic is when one locality, one particular area, and that area alone has some kind of an illness that spreads, that devastates the community, hurts the people, etc. Pandemic is when you put a P in front of it and the epidemic gets like a passport. So as a mnemonic device, remember the P. That's when it spreads. So this COVID-19 situation starts in Wuhan. When it's there alone, it's an epidemic. The minute it crosses the border, it becomes a pandemic. Now, during the medieval time period, of which we'll discuss some of these cases, they were epidemics and they were pandemics. And the problem is that when you discuss Jewish history, and you really want to know exactly what did people do, and I get this question all the time. Oh, tell me, were there schools? What happened if there was an epidemic? Like, what did they do 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago? And the answer is, sometimes there is an answer, and sometimes there is no answer because we have no sources. So what I would like to do is only concentrate on those situations where sources do exist and do tell a story of what communities did. Now, you might know and you might not know what the Cairo Geniza is, but in short, roughly about 110 years ago or so, in Cairo, a discovery was made that we call the Cairo Geniza. If I take away the word Geniza and substitute it for Shemus, maybe that would make more sense. So imagine a building, and this was a two-story building in Cairo. Its old name was Fostat, and that's where the Rambam lived. And for roughly about 1,000 years, people threw Shemus in there. The term for Shemus in the Sephardi world or in Chazal is Geniza, to hide something away. So imagine a building that starts at the bottom, at the basement, and for 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, you throw anything written in Hebrew, Kodesh or not Kodesh. Roughly from about the year 700 till about the 1600s, people were throwing Shemus in here. Eventually, in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, this is discovered and doesn't become news immediately, but soon the world hears of it, and people look through every single fragment of what's in there. Over 1 million fragments. So we suddenly discover the handwriting of the Rambam in there. Commentaries of Rishonim that we never knew before. Poetry of Rav Sadia Gaon. Books of Rav Sadia that we never knew existed. Book lists listing what a bookseller would be selling. Even something as mundane as, what should I say, laundry lists. But within there too, in Hebrew many times, and most of the times in what we call Judeo-Arabic, which is like the Yiddish of the Jews who lived in our Arab countries, Judeo-Arabic. For some reason, we as Jews in our Golas, no matter where we live, developed our own language. Yiddish, for example, and we still speak Yiddish. Yiddish gets picked up. It's a mixture of Hebrew and German, and then Polish and Russian and everything else in between. Spanish Jews have Ladino. Persian Jews speak of Yehudit Farsit, Judeo-Persian. Jews that lived in Arab countries, like the Rambam in Muslim countries, spoke Judeo-Arabic. In fact, the Rambam's Svarim, all of them, except for the Mishnah Torah, were written in Judeo-Arabic. Later on, they get translated. So when this Cairo Geniza gets discovered, as we go through it, we begin to discover sources for the first, and these will be the earliest sources, of epidemics and what these epidemics did to the Jewish communities in that part of the world. And some were pretty fascinating. So let me pull up some of them and tell you about them as we read them. Realize, though, what some of these epidemics end up doing. They devastate communities. People go into quarantine and they're alone, they're isolated. People do not communicate the way we communicate today, and I'll speak of that in a different venue in a second. But because of this isolation, because records are so few, what has survived are letters. Letters about great people, and letters about communities, and letters of a husband writing to his wife because he got stuck in India, lives in Cairo in the early 1000s. Imagine, more than 1,000 years ago. And he got stuck there because there's an epidemic. And he writes to his wife, there's a mageifa. In fact, it's a pretty strong one, and I can't come home. I hope to come home. And it's in this time period we begin to see movement of people gets limited. The idea of commerce and going from place to place, sometimes during epidemics, suddenly no one's going anywhere. And the answer is no one was going because people were afraid to travel. But in this Cairo Geniza, we uncovered documents of a particular hunger and an epidemic of an illness. Now, what the illness was, we do not know, but hundreds of people died. And we see that from the Cairo Geniza documents that survived, where not only individuals are writing to each other, but lo and behold, we find tefillos, we find prayers. Prayers of people praying for each other, and then wondering why the epidemic happened, and they declare fast days and gatherings of Tehillim where they could gather unless they didn't want to leave. But one of them begins to hit a very important personality. In the early 1100s, the Jewish community of Egypt, one of the great Chachamim, or Chachamim, was a Chacham whose name was Mevorech ben Sadia HaNogid. And this great Chacham dies in the month of December, together with imagine, 60,000 other people had died. Jews and non-Jews had died in that epidemic. But here was this great Talmud Chacham. And then in the Cairo Geniza too, we discover a super interesting document. And it has to do, and I'll show you another book. I don't know if you've ever seen this book. but it's the Maspik La'ovdei Hashem. It's the book that the son, and you can see the name here, Avraham ben Harambam, the son of famous Maimonides. Avraham ben Harambam wrote this book. Now, just to give you a little background, the Rambam had two children. One was a daughter, and she died quite young, and the Rambam writes about it, and he was devastated by her death. We don't know the cause. Maybe it was some kind of a epidemic or illness. But years later, he has a son named Avram, and he loved his son. He did everything for his son, described his son. When that son reached the age of 18, the Rambam, and that was the year 1204, the Rambam passes away. Now, the son of the Rambam, this Rabbeinu Avram, was one of the great Chachamim of the time. He wrote many other Sfarim. Hamaspik La'ovdei Hashem is a book that instructs a person as a manual how to serve Hashem. He also wrote Shelos Utshuvos, Birkos Avram, and he wrote a commentary to the Torah that has survived. So here's this great person. Now, what's beautiful about him is that he was a physician. He was a doctor. And one of the Cairo Geniza letters, such a sensitive person, very much like his father. And we read his letters. Imagine the greatness of this Cairo Geniza when we now discover all these things and we're able to read them. And one of the letters he writes to one of his students who invited him to come to his wedding. The student was making what we call a chasana, and he said, Rebbe, I would like for you to come to my wedding. And Avraham ben Harambam answered, my dear student, as much as I would love to be there, that night, and the date is given, that night I am responsible for the ward in the hospital. It's my duty to be that night in the hospital, and I can't leave my patients. This very man, and let me give you the exact year, this very person in 1216 fell ill to a plague. And the plague was horrible. The entire town, which was Felstadt, was visited by this plague. People couldn't move. People were dying. And we actually have a letter describing, and I'll read to you the letter. It says, as to Adonenu Rosh HaNogid, which is Rabbeinu Avram, the Rav, he's seriously ill. May Hashem heal him, and his daughter, for he is unable to treat his daughter, neither at night nor in the day. It caused him great grief. May again Hashem grant him health. And he describes this Avraham can't get out of bed. And everyone, continues this letter writer, everyone strives to save himself from the great plague. Everyone is alone. And we're trying to figure out how to get together and make this work. In fact, what are we really doing? And here becomes that beautiful idea which we see. Because people are in great trouble, and they are so concerned with and occupied with themselves, they have no time and care for others. So let's not forget the others, and let's begin to see what we can do for others in this epidemic. Meaning those people who are well, to go out, some of the documents indicate, and make loans for people. They couldn't be working, their economic situation was ruined. People didn't have food. So suddenly in the Cairo Geniza, and we have other ones which I won't drive you crazy with, ideas of famous teachers who had passed away, cantors in their communities who had passed away. And you begin to get some sense of the devastation that really was happening in this part of the world. And there are a few more out in the East, and our sources about them are either now from Muslim sources, but because of the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, we know so much more of these epidemics. And one of the beautiful things we discover are the sensitivities of people for each other in the midst of so much pain. Now again, we're living in a very different world, and we're so lucky. And I'll explain that again in a second. But let me go to what should I call it? The pandemic. A pandemic that lasts for quite a while. In fact, it's still in the world to a certain minimal amount. It was called the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague is absolutely interesting. And just to give you an introduction to what this was, in 1346, 1347, and notice I've skipped about 200 years of our history, because when we speak, let's say, of Rashi and the Balei Tosfos, yes, there are epidemics. We know little about them, but they go through crusades and wars, and they're dealing with different things, not with pandemics. But those communities too get suffering and need to figure out what to do. But today we're just discussing the epidemics. In 1346, 1347, Tartars, Mongolians, attacked the Christians in the city of Kaffa. Today, there is no Kaffa anymore. Today, it's called Theodosia. In Kaffa, which was a great seaport in the Black Sea, the Mongolians had come and attacked them. In their attack, the Mongolians discover that there's some kind of an illness going around. And they do not know what it is, but their own troops are dying. And they realize fighting the enemy and at the same time dealing with whatever epidemic they were undergoing is not going to work. And they had the city of Kaffa surrounded. So what did they do? They took their dead soldiers, their cadavers, their bodies, put them on catapults, and just shot them over the walls. And one after the other, these dead people who had died from what will become known as the bubonic plague, the Black Death, now suddenly is spread to the city. And some of the great merchants who had come to Kaffa to buy merchandise, to take it to Italy, immediately get out of there without realizing they're on their boats, and about 12 of them leave to go to the city of Messina, the city in Sicily, an island off Italy. So they reached there, by the way, by roughly about October of 1348. And they come into the seaport of Messina, and people begin to wait for their merchandise that they've ordered and all the goodies, which included furs and spices. And as the boats approach, they begin to smell, and they realize something is wrong. They're looking for the people who are in charge of the boats. They don't see that many. And they begin to get very nervous. As the boats approach, and a number of people, here's the mistake, immediately climb onto these boats. And basically, the crew of each one of these boats, they're dead, cadavers, smell, rats running all over. And people realize there's something wrong here. Get off this boat. And yes, the dozens and dozens of people who got onto these 12 boats send the boats out to shore and set them on fire, not realizing that they have now brought the Black Plague into Europe. And from Sicily, it crosses into Italy, and in the next 3 years, 20 million people will die from the Black Plague. It will spread across the entire globe for the next 10 years. They estimate roughly 70 million people died. Europe, imagine 20 million people get wiped out within 3 to 5 years. Now, this Black Plague was horrible. Again, diarrhea, vomiting, welts on your body, bleeding internally. And of course, the people wanted to helped, but as they helped, they themselves got it, and they spread it even more. So no one was saved from this. Now, to read kind of interesting, the documents about the Black Plague, for the first time, begin to accuse the Jews of having spread it. And the reason they thought so was because Jews too were hit by it. But the difference was that the number of Jews initially, as the Black Plague spread, were not somehow affected by it. And clearly, there's no doubt it was because of the laws of hygiene, the laws of washing the Tilas Yadayim al Negel Wasser and going to a mikveh and bathing and Lechvot Shabbos, doing something to have yourself clean, which was not done in Europe by anybody. Even monarchy took a bath maybe once a month, or maybe in between seasons. But Jews bathed and kept clean. And you know what? It saved them. But because it saved them, it also brought a great calamity. The accusation by hundreds that the Jews were responsible, they had poisoned the wells. And suddenly, after 1348, the massive Ashkenazi communities of Europe get devastated. Thousands and thousands who had survived are killed because of the Black Plague. Granted, Pope Clement VI got involved and said the Jews had nothing to do with it. And many great people said the Jews had nothing to do with it. Look, they're also dying with just as many. Maybe initially not so many, but eventually it spread to the Jewish community too. But it was at this point that a number of interesting things happened. The word quarantine came into being because of the Black Plague. Initially, it was suggested that anyone who came in contact with someone who had died put themselves away for 30 days. It didn't work, so they extended it to 40 days. Hence, if you know a little bit of Latin, and the word quarantine and the word quart or quarter is in there. So it came from the word 40. Quarantining for 40 days was what the word quarantine meant initially. Because of the Black Plague now, it took on the meaning that we use today in our modern period, which is to quarantine. It was from this time period. At the same time, though, these communities, some of them, begin to have a massive migration into Poland, where there was safety. So the Jews come into Poland in large numbers in the 1350s, 1360s, escaping all the Germanic or the western parts of Europe, where not only was the Black Plague spreading, and eventually comes to Poland too, of course, but Jews were being killed. In Poland, they were not. So suddenly that community grows big. But something else happens in this time period. We notice for the first time the word yahrzeit. Now, the yahrzeit might be an older word, but the first recording of the word yahrzeit comes from this time period. It's in this time period that we begin to see the moving of Yizkor. Yizkor was only said on Yom Kippur. The moving of Yizkor to the Shalosh Regalim, to all three Yomim Tovim. It happens in this time period. It's in this time period that we begin to see the increase in Memor Buchs, they were called in Yiddish. Memor Buchs, where the communities basically kept for themselves tiny little records of who died, who was born, the Moel and which Bris Milah took place when, and who died and why they died. And these books were read at each yahrzeit. The Memor book would be taken out, and in each community, in each kahila, the names of whoever had passed would be said. It's in this time period, if you begin to trace, a very interesting tefillah that we say. Now, we daven much, and in our davening, we do have different Avinu Malkeinus. But let me show you one particular one. Again, here's an interesting siddur. It's a siddur that records the version of Catalonia. That's in Spain, where the Ramban lives and the Rashba. The great Rishonim of Spain live in Catalonia. Barcelona is there. And in this siddur, basically from manuscripts that describe davening from the 1300s, 1400s, they had a version of Avinu Malkeinu very similar to ours, both in the Sephardi, and I mean Eidot HaMizrach, or in the Ashkenazi rite. Avinu Malkeinu Kale Deve V'cherev Ra'ov Shvi Umageifa B'nei Brisecho. And the Ashkenazim have a drop longer. They had one similar to what the Ashkenazim say, Avinu Malkeinu Atzor Mageifa Minach Lasecha. We have it with Mem Nun Ayin, Mena'ah, hold back a mageifa. They were saying Atzor Mageifa Minach Lasecha. Stop the mageifa from our midst. And it's from this time period and on that you begin to find the earliest tefillos. And if you have a good collection of tefillos for refuah shalema, for cholim, to be safe from a mageifa, they all come from this time period. And suddenly people began to wonder, what could they do as a shmira? And here you begin to already see, say, the Ketores. The idea of checking a mezuzah begins in this time period, and it spreads, where suddenly we hear of people saying, there's an epidemic. Before you lock yourself in, check the mezuzah. And in one of the records I saw, I don't remember where, somehow on someone's mezuzah, the word mezuzos was basically rubbed out, except only letters left, where the mem a vav and a tuf that's spelled maves. And suddenly the Shlo eventually in the 1500s and 1600s will write about how mezuzah protects you because of zaz maves. Again, a play on the word mezuzah. The mezuzah, and in schus of having a kosher mezuzah, it'll save you. So lo and behold, what you have are these super changes that came as a result of the Black Death. Quite many. But this plague spreads. And it spreads across Europe. And every couple of years it repeats itself, and it repeats itself, and it repeats itself. It's contained in one area, and suddenly in the 1500s, we hear of it again in Italy, in the city of Venice. Now, you might have been to Venice, and you've seen Venice. And the Jews in Venice, for the first time in Jewish history, were put into a ghetto. In fact, they had two ghettos, if you remember, if you've been there. The old one and the new one. Now, the ghetto in Venice, in 1510, the mageifa hits. And again, it's the bubonic plague. And again, here, interestingly, Jews are not hit first. And the community of Venice realizes that, hey, there's something about the Jewish people, and they were not the ones who were hit. And therefore, what are they doing? And the answer is, we're just washing, we're being careful, we're not touching, we're not going out. And suddenly you hear in the neighboring communities of Venice, let's emulate the Jews. So here in Venice, at least initially in this particular situation, the Jewish community was not penalized. In fact, they looked at the Jews as being the ones who might be helping them, and suddenly they're washing and they're being more sanitary. Interestingly enough, in our, what we call in our Shelos Uchuvos, one of the more important ones, written in Venice in this time period, is this famous Chacham, whose name is Rabbi Meir of Padua. Padua was a great city in Italy where there was a great medical school, and it was the only medical school in all of Europe that firm Jews could attend. In fact, Jews were welcome to Padua, which was right next to Venice. So if you were the chief rabbi of Padua, you were immediately the chief rabbi of Venice, and vice versa. So Rabbi Meir of Padua, who lives in the late 1400s and early 1500s, he passed away in 1565, one day gets a letter, and I'll read you the letter in Hebrew and translate. And if you ever want to look it up, it's in Siman Pei Vav of his Shelos Uchuvos. And he's asked by a fellow whose name is Yochanan, B'inyan Shelosecho, the question that you approached to me, Al Malamed, about a teacher, Shebarach Talmido Me'iro, that his student ran away. The student ran away from the Rebbe. Be'esa Ketzef, Kasher Heichal HaNegev beVenetzia. This is 1510 in Venice. So imagine a student runs away. Now, because the student ran away, he didn't pay schar limud to his Rebbe. So the Maram of Padua was asked, does he now have to pay? And again, in a very poignant response, Rabbi Meir, his full name was Meir Katzelenbogen, Rabbi Meir of Padua, answers, of course not. It's an ones. And besides, he was a na'ar rach v'leva. He was a young man. You don't expect a young man who was basically doing something smart, running for his life because he didn't want to catch whatever it was, to be able to now say, well, I owed you the money. And in fact, he says, had you even made a neder initially that you would get paid under any circumstances? I'm not sure that such a circumstance would even warrant that, because this is so unusual. When there's a mageifa, he writes, everybody runs. Everybody runs away. And these types of responsa become very common in this time period. Now, what I found very interesting that I would love to share with you, and I said how different and lucky we are. I own this sefer. I hardly ever looked at it. So you can imagine, it's called Igros Malamdin, the teacher's letters, or letters of teachers. This is from the 1500s and early 1600s. These are Italian machanchim, if you want to call them that. These are all teachers of Torah who teach in Italy. And their letters were collected by a scholar and put all together in this book. The scholar's name was Yaakov Buxbaum. And I pick it up, couple of months ago, or I think a month, I don't even know what time it is anymore, what day, after this epidemic or pandemic started, and almost by mistake, I go to the back and I see the word mageifa. I go, oh, letters of teachers about a mageifa. Let me look it up. So going through it, it is so unbelievable. 1500s, 1600s, Italy. Dozens and dozens of Torah teachers are isolated from their students. They have no svarim. Many aren't getting paid. Many are locked up in homes with no food. And they're worried about where their students are. So just, a second, pause in your mind and put parentheses around what I'm saying. I teach. So when this thing hit, okay, I'm still teaching. So for like 50 some days, I ended up teaching on Zoom. And how lucky I was to see my students, for them to see me, to communicate. That bond of learning Torah didn't stop. And for people who don't want to use the internet, okay, on the phone. But that bond continues. There is no communication in this world that they lived in. But the beauty of being concerned about their students and writing to the homes, saying, how is Yaakov? I am the Melamed from Firenze. I know the mageifa and what's going on. He was a pretty skinny kid and didn't eat a lot. How is he doing? Or vice versa, letters to the teachers, Rebbe, here are my 16 questions, because I was learning myself. Can you answer them? And the procedure of writing back. And again, you drop a letter in the mail, like who does that anymore, right? Push a button, there goes your text or your email, and you've answered someone in 3 seconds. Here, can you imagine the students eagerly awaiting to receive a response from the Rebbe? And the Rebbe who has nothing because he's locked up somewhere, suddenly saying in a letter that out of nowhere someone had given someone a package, and this package, and eventually it gets to him, and it was basic sustenance and sometimes even payment to be able to sustain himself. So the beauty of the Jewish people, again, throughout this, and here's a tiny little testimony to the resilience of Torah learning in a situation when Torah learning was, how could we? We're locked. We're locked in a house. But what makes it even more interesting is that there are a number of svarim, many, that were written only during pandemics or epidemics. And if you read the titles, I'll show you some of them and tell you their history. For example, you might have heard of Rabbi Moshe Almushnino, who wrote a beautiful commentary to Pirkei Avos called Pirkei Moshe. He lives in Salonika in the late 1500s. And suddenly there's an epidemic. Now this sefer he had already written, but lo and behold, he finds himself, and he writes this in the introduction to a different book he wrote called Tefillah LaMoshe, a commentary on the Siddur. He says, I'm stuck. No one's going out. Ein yotze ve'ein nichnas. No one's going in, no one's going out. So I don't know what to do. So I decided as a Todal Hashem to thank Hashem that I have survived, that my family have survived as we ran away. I want to take prayer. I want to take tefillah, the connection that we have between us and Hashem, and write a commentary to it. And he writes this beautiful commentary to his siddur as a result of an epidemic. And that, for example, goes on with sefer after sefer. It's like so unbelievable. For example, if you ever look at it, people have it and they look at it. Sefer Yikarim of the famous Rabbi Yosef Albo has a commentary inside, the Ohel Yaakov. The Ohel Yaakov also, in this time period, says, I'm stuck home. I don't know what to do. And I can't learn Gemara because during epidemics, and this you see in many of the Svarim written during this time period, and there's so many during epidemics across the 15, 16, 1700s, my mind doesn't have the mind to learn Gemara. Gemara needs serious iyun rav, they write. Therefore, this is a book of philosophy. It's a book of Jewish philosophy. Let me write a commentary. And he writes this entire book in this particular time period. The Ramah, the famous Rabbi Moshe Isserles, wrote his commentary, Mochir Yayin, on Megillas Esther in the 1500s when he had to escape the epidemic in Krakow. And he writes how he escaped the epidemic in Krakow in his particular introduction to Mochir Yain. He says that year we were all quarantined. No one had Sudas Purim. There was no Simchas Purim that year. No one went to shul. We didn't read the Megillah. And you begin to see, wait a second, similar to like happened partially to us in a certain way. Yeah, it happened to them. But here again, the resilience of not saying, I'm giving up or I'm just locking myself up. No. Here's the time, and let me devote it to Torah learning. So let me write a commentary, a Perush, says the Ramah, to Megillas Esther. One of the great Mekubalim, the grandfather of the Chidah, Rabbi Avraham Azulai was his name, who lives in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the Chesel Avram, who, by the way, wrote his book in the city of Gaza. Okay, sometimes people say, oh, Jews didn't live in Gaza. Jews always lived in Gaza. There were great centers of learning in Gaza. But this great Chacham, Avraham Azulai, who was a Mekubal, it's a Sefer Kabbalah, wrote his book in Gaza, because what had happened is he was born in Europe. He had come to Eretz Yisrael and decided to live in Hebron. From Hebron, where suddenly there's an epidemic, he runs with his family to Yerushalayim, where the epidemic also has spread and people are dying. Now, I didn't read to you any of the introductions of these few Sfarim I mentioned so far, where they describe hundreds of people dying, many having lost members of their family. That painful stuff, I'm sure you can understand. But he writes here in this book, as a chesed to Hashem, I'm writing this book. So it's chesed Avram, it's Avraham Azulai writing this, because in the midst of having been saved, in, what should I say, buried in tragedy, there's still a chesed, there's still that silver lining and that light to say thank you, Hashem, for all this. And this continues with Sefer after Sefer. But one very interesting point, and then I'm almost done, is that, and I'll just show you one. There are dozens and dozens of. This is a Pinchas. Actually, it's a Pinchas of the Jewish community of Padua that we mentioned earlier. Now, Pinchasim exist for any Jewish community where records have survived. Pinchas, similar to a memoir book that just recorded events and names, Pinchas are the actual doings of the community, where each Kehillah, like the Gemara Megillah tells us about the Asara Batlanim and the Shiva Tuvei Ha'ir, you need 7 people who are concerned about the betterment of the city. They kept records. What is beautiful in all of them, there are instructions of what to do during an epidemic. It says you need to stay inside. There's a takana sakehila to quarantine yourself. There's a takana sakehila not to go outside. And they were so concerned about making sure the community survived and that people didn't die unnecessarily, if possible, by suggesting that they do certain things. And every community had such laws in their Pekasim. And eventually, though, as we hit the 1800s, cholera comes around. Now, cholera comes from a Greek word, actually, chalar, which basically is the bile, because cholera brought with it basically vomiting and diarrhea. So it was known already in the 1600s, or maybe even earlier, some think, but it's identified by the early 1800s. And cholera begins to spread in Europe. Immediately, greatest of Rabbanim, from Rabbi Akiva Eger to the Chassam Sofer, like you've seen the Mishnah Brura quoting at the beginning of the Shir, the Sefer Pischei Olam, about cholera. Now, interestingly, people begin to play on the word here. In fact, if you have nothing to do and you want to do like a word search in Sfarim, spell cholera any way you want to, and you will get a hit. There was no official spelling. In fact, some played around with it as holy ra. In fact, in Yiddish, if you know sometimes a very derogatory term about someone, he's a cholera. That term comes from this horrible illness, where again and again you begin to see people dying, but you also begin to see communities literally setting up tzedakah and chesed to help people, and the Balei Halacha getting involved and wondering. In a famous tshuva, Rabbi Akiva Eger printed in his families in the Igro Sofer, where the Eger Sofer family printed some of the letters. There's a beautiful letter that he wrote Erev Yom Kippur of 1831 to all the Gvirim outside of where he lived in Posen, saying, it's Erev Yom Kippur, we have been struck here by cholera, which, by the way, sometimes is spelled with a kuf also, cholera, and we need help. And Hashem has blessed you, to the people that he's writing in different cities in Europe. I think some of it went to Hamburg and where great Ashirim and Gvirim lived, to say, look, there are so many poor people in these places, and therefore please come through and donate to us. And all these narratives basically keep on going. So to close it all together, here we are in 2020, and hopefully, stage 1, stage 2, every city's got a whole different code of this. But here I am, I'm sitting in the comfort of a backyard, being socially distant from the young man who's being so kind to give me more than 6 feet, and I'm boring him with this, to realize, wow, my words of this discussion will go out and people will watch it. But imagine how Baruch Hashem lucky we are. We have running water. There's medication today. And those 2 words, Chazdei Hashem, are so appropriate. Yes, we've lost a lot of very good people. But in schus of learning about and how they acted, let this all be some kind of what should I call the schus. And by the way, as I'm ending off, in many of these situations, the question is, what's the greatest protector? Oh, the mezuzah, this and that. Oh, what's the greatest protection? What's the Taurus? Tough Reshut Samach. Mipnei Paranios. What's the best protection? Torah learning. So they wrote Sfarim. They studied Torah. And through these venues, we can now spread Torah more. So as they say in Yiddish, be gesund, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these few little stories about pandemics and epidemics, and we should all be zoche to be asago al tzedek b'mheira b'yameinu. Thank you so much.